I ask myself this and I tell my community to do the same. Ask yourself, why should my audience care? If you can't answer that question about what you're sharing, then you're just sharing to share.
Get ready to build, protect, and sell your expertise online with the Online Genius Podcast. You'll laugh. We hope you won't cry, but you'll always be informed and prepared so you can have the success you want. Here's your host, Bobby Klink.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to this week's episode of the Online Genius Podcast. I am your host, Bobby Klink, and I'm really excited for today's show because we're going to be talking about a foundational concept and skill that every entrepreneur needs to employ. Specifically, we're going to be talking about creating your brand and, more importantly, your brand story. And this is a concept that I discovered recently, quite honestly. I'd been thinking about things in a different way, but I discovered it through reading books. But luckily, you're not going to have to read a book because I have a wonderful guest here today to talk about it. Today's guest expert is Michelle Knight. Michelle is a mother, wife, world traveler, and storyteller. She is also a branding and business coach and the founder of BrandMary.com. She works with female entrepreneurs who are struggling to gain visibility and traction in taking their business to the next level and supports them in tapping into their story to create a standout brand and a message that positions them as an expert in their industry. Michelle launched her freedom-based business and left her 9-to-5 while raising a new baby. Now she spends her time supporting women to achieve time, financial, and location freedom while traveling the world with her little family of 3 and exploring life with her son. Welcome to the Online Genius Podcast, Michelle.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
Now, Michelle, I'm really excited to talk about branding and brand stories, but I always like to ask a couple of questions of my guests about their lives that aren't related to business. And one of them is that for you is that in preparing for the interview, you mentioned that you actually had what I think of as a pretty interesting idea of something else that you might have wanted as a potential career.
Oh, yeah.
What was that?
Actually, it's quite a few things, but the two main ones were originally, I actually wanted to be in musical theater. Okay. I wanted to be on Broadway, and life changed a bit with my story. And actually, then I went back to college to be a communications and PR rep. So public relations all the way.
Well, but you also mentioned that you at one point wanted to be a crime scene investigator. Is that right?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that was one of the other ones, right? Because like I said, I've wanted to be so many different things in my life. It's so funny. Yeah, I've always been fascinated with Law and Order. Growing up, I used to watch it all the time. And so I actually originally looked at the school that I went to for communications and public relations to be a crime scene investigator.
Well, so it was watching TV that got you interested in? Is that what really stoked the interest for you?
Totally. I just really loved the whole solving the problem. You know what I mean? Like trying to figure out who did it. The mystery was always so exciting for me.
Well, as a former criminal prosecutor, let me go ahead and tell you, I think you made the right decision because being a crime scene investigator is not nearly as glamorous as CSI makes it seem. We actually had to constantly ask questions of a jury to make sure, or potential jury to make sure they didn't expect us to come forward with the kinds of evidence that show made it seem like we're normal.
Oh my gosh, I know. Yeah, I'm really glad I made that decision early on.
Well, the other question I want to ask you is about your son. It's a son, correct?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And how old is your son?
He's 2. He just turned 2.
And how do you go about balancing your career with the pull of a son? I deal with this. I have a 4-year-old daughter, so I can relate. And I wonder how you would go about it or what the best advice you would have for other entrepreneurs who have small children is.
Definitely. So for me, it was just making the decision really early on that I wanted this balance between my career, right? This journey, this entrepreneur journey that I was setting out on, and being able to be with my son. And so for me, that meant leaving my 9-to-5 and being home. But the day to day, it's about really just prioritizing the things that need to get done. And I incorporate my son into my brand so much, which I know isn't available for everyone, but he's been on live streams with me. He's been on photo shoots. He'll be there in the room when I'm on calls. So I just really set the intention early on that I wanted him to be part of this business and that I would do what was necessary to make that happen.
It sounds like great advice. It sounds like, and I just finished up reading The One Thing, and that has actually been, wonderful for me. And I see what you're saying there is very much that to you, your one thing very much was to have a life that encompassed your business, but also your role as a mother. And so you basically set an intention and you just made it that part of your mission in life. Definitely.
I think it all comes down to setting it and then taking the action to make it happen. I mean, this is really the reason I became an entrepreneur in the first place, because I wanted that life so I could kind of do what I wanted to do at the end of the day, and then just created a whole business around that.
Yeah, that is, I think, great advice. And it's a good segue, because I want to now kind of transition over to what we're really here to talk about. Mm-hmm. And that's the issue of creating a brand and a brand story. And in preparing for the interview, I asked you, what you consider kind of your one area of expertise. And you said it's authentic branding through storytelling. So I guess my question is, what does that mean to you? And can you explain what you mean when you say authentic branding through storytelling?
Definitely. So just sharing a little bit of my own journey. When I started my business, I lost myself and really what I set out to do, because I was constantly looking at what everyone else was doing around me. I had this idea I wanted to start a business, so I started researching other people who were successful. And in the process, I started to really kind of become them, essentially. And so I lost that piece of myself. When I took a step back and rather than looking outward, started looking inward and started sharing me and the things that could connect me with my ideal client and allow me to just show up as myself and not worry about, do I look okay today? You know what I mean? Or should I talk about this today? It was really just this authentic, this is what I feel like my audience needs to hear. This is what I want to share today. When I started to really focus on those pieces, my brand took off online, and I started to really attract a community of women that were really looking for the same thing. So what I focus on, no matter where you are in your business, I focus on really looking at your story, setting that strong foundation, which then leads you to the key pieces of ideal client, messaging, branding, and being able to continue to build on that to grow your business.
So I think that's great overview of the process. And it actually, let me step back, because I think in that description, one of the things that comes through is you very much are a proponent of having a personal brand versus a brand that is not personal to you. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. So I'm talking more about mainly service-based entrepreneurs who are the face of their brand and business. But I also really encourage product-based entrepreneurs who maybe sell pieces of jewelry or even woodworking or different pieces like that to tie in their story anywhere they can to build that trust with their community.
Well, so what are, in a sense, I think we ought to back up. So one way to approach life or your business is to have a personal brand. So again, it could be, that you are the face, but also you could have something that's not a personal brand. What would be an example of something where it's not a personal brand in the context of entrepreneurship and online entrepreneurs?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that for me and my audience is mostly people who sell a product of some kind. So if you sell, t-shirts that you design online, or again, if you make jewelry yourself and sell that on Etsy, those are the main focus is the product that you are selling. But again, what I really encourage people to do is, even though that's the main focus, where can you really share pieces of your story throughout so that your audience wants to come to you to buy the product and not somebody else?
And I also think it's important to distinguish that you can have a personal brand even if you use something other than your personal name for your brand. For example, your website is not michelleknight.com. It's something else, but you would still say you have a personal brand. Is that right?
Yes, because I'm the face of my business. So I am essentially, what I say is, people are not only investing in themselves, they're investing in me.
Now, is there a problem with that as you expand? And I guess maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves. I think a lot of people are afraid of having a personal brand because then they feel like they have to be there the whole time and be doing all of the work themselves rather than having other people who are brought into the fold.
Oh, definitely. It's a really good question. So I'm a big advocate for actually getting an amazing team behind you. It's something I waited way too long to do, but I don't really think that's the case. I think as you expand and grow, it's expected that you have a team that helps you run your business, right? But at the end of the day, it is you that is like showing up in photos. It is you that is showing up in maybe a live video. It is you that is posting in your community. It might not be you that's responding to every single email, but your audience understands that the people there are meant to support you and your brand.
Okay. Well, and another thing I think that some people will have problems getting over on the concept of having a personal brand will be people who feel like, well, my qualifications aren't really from my story. They're from my expertise. And I think I'm a prime example of this. For a long time, I resisted bringing myself into my brand because, look, I'm a lawyer. And so I have all these credentials. I have all this training. So in your mind, should people like me still be using a personal brand and using our story, or is what you teach only relevant to a different kind of entrepreneur who is really teaching more based purely upon experience?
Well, I think the first piece is that all of those expertise and trainings in college, all of those type of, on paper type of qualifications, those are part of your story. I really do believe that. They're the easier pieces to kind of identify. Usually when we're thinking about our niche, when we're starting out, it's easier to say, oh, I went to college for this. I have a certification in this. That's where people tend to start. What I encourage them to do is always go a step further and think of the things maybe they've taught themselves throughout the years or how they've transitioned from this to this. So I think the story work applies to everyone in one way or another. But you essentially have to make the decision, how visible do I want to be with my brand and my business? Deciding that in the beginning, and then and we'll talk, I'm sure, about how to know what pieces of your story to actually share. But that kind of sets it up for you in your business.
Well, so let me back up, or let me ask you that fundamental question then. How do you how should an entrepreneur make the decision about how prominent a role they should play and their story should play in the business?
Oh, good question. So I think that that's a big piece of looking inward and saying, do I want to be the face, right? Do I want to be the one that is on the live video, right? Because you have to be visible, right? In the online space. If you're an online entrepreneur, you need to be ready to get out there on social media, be visible, have the website, all the moving pieces. Are you comfortable with that being centered around you and your story, knowing that to really build that trust, you're going to need to share pieces of your story. Not everything. I'm not a big fan of, sharing your diary is not the same as vulnerability, but really having that comfort level and admitting to yourself, am I comfortable with this? If you're not, then there are different smaller things that you can do, but most of the women that I work with are like, yes, I want to build a business around me, my story, and help other people as well.
Okay. Well, so now let's say you've made the decision that you want your personal story to be part of your brand. Mm-hmm. When you've made that decision, how do you go about crafting your brand and then more importantly, your brand story? Kind of what's the process you should go through?
Yeah, definitely. So the first thing that I recommend people do is really look inward at their story, as we kind of talked about before. So the main thing that I teach is to identify 3 key points in your life, 3 transitions, if you will. Maybe it is going to college, graduating college, those things that are easy to identify on paper. I know for me, it was more of life changes. I lost my brother to childhood cancer, and that really changed the trajectory of my life. The birth of my son, again, changed the trajectory of my life. So picking out those kind of 3 key pieces, and then really, I call it a brain dump, writing down all the things you've taught yourself that you feel qualified to do, that you love to do, and starting to identify the connectors between them. So when I did this in my own journey, I was like, oh man, I love communication. I absolutely went to school for communication. I have that qualification. I did musical theater. I love being on live video. I love social media. I love branding. And so it became really clear. And from that, I was able to really find my niche. And so that's kind of the very first piece of, for me, the branding process.
Well, and let me kind of tell you in a sense, or walk you through, and you can critique what I did in my thought process, because for a long time I didn't do this and I resisted. But at the end of the day, I kind of went through that process, and what I came to is in a sense, and this I guess is, there's some level of this that I'm not sure is my brand story. There's a lot that I have that I kind of walk through various transitions in my career and my life. But one of the things that came through is that I was never a typical lawyer. For example, I played in a punk rock band in college. I had a long ponytail that I dyed various colors. And I went from that to go to Harvard Law School. And for a long time, I tried to play the role of lawyer man, a very stuffy lawyer. And that's just not me. And so in crafting my story, eventually kind of what I came to was that I quit being a stuffy lawyer and started just being me. And is that the kind of thing how you would tell a story of kind of the arc of your life, where, again, I kind of sprinkle in my credentials, but also what makes me different, and things that are maybe why you, entrepreneur, might like to talk with me instead of, the guy in the 3-piece suit?
Definitely. And I think a key piece in that too is you identified your ideal client, right? Like, so your ideal client is someone that doesn't want to deal with someone in a 3-piece suit, right? And so I think that helps you identify the pieces that you share, right? That more laid back approach, the more of you deciding you didn't want that lifestyle and choosing a different lifestyle, right? Creating this online business. But again, like you said, you sprinkling in, and that's actually what I call them. I call them sprinkles, right? Knowing your audience and kind of sprinkling in either the credentials or the other little pieces that really give you that expert status, but also set you apart from other people in your industry.
I think that's great advice. Let me back up. In preparing to interview you today, one of the things I did is I went out and I found other places where you've talked. And one of them, we're both speakers at the Infopreneur Summit, which will be coming up in February. And in your interviews there, one of the things you talked about was coming up with the 3 transition points. Can you talk about that and what role those transition points play in developing your brand story?
Yeah. So the 3 transitions, as I kind of mentioned before, it's just a really good starting place for people. When I talk to women and men, right, through podcasts and things, when you ask somebody to just write down a list of things from the very beginning, sometimes you get stuck, right? Because your mind just kind of kicks in and you're like, oh, that's not important, or I don't really know how to do that. We start second guessing ourselves. But it's a lot easier to say, man, what are the 3 biggest pieces of my life that have led me to this moment? Are there 3 times in my life where I was set out to do something and I changed direction, or something happened, or it didn't feel good, right? And so by starting there, that really kind of starts to help you identify your ideal client, your niche. You actually start developing your messaging, which is something I teach as well, and starting to become clear on what is the connector between them.
And when you say the connector, what do you mean by connector?
Yeah. So this is how we carry those 3 transitions, and really the foundation of a brand story is the connector. So looking at those pieces and saying, what is similar between these? So for me, just to share a little bit of my story, my very first transition is deciding to say bye to a full ride to Loyola University and move to California for theater. The second was the loss of my brother and deciding that I needed to do something different with my life. And the third was the birth of my son. And finally, following this pull to become an entrepreneur and not have to get permission to, go on vacation or take a sick day. And the connector between all of these was this deep, deep desire for freedom, this deep desire to basically do what I wanted to do rather than living life according to the shoulds. Now, if you look at my brand, freedom is the connector. Freedom is the basis. My hook involves freedom. My photos are freedom. Everything stems from that connector.
So, then in your messaging, I assume you're largely messaging that your story is about freedom, but also that's an important part of what you provide to your clients.
Yes, definitely. So my clients want that time, financial, and location freedom that we talked about in the beginning, right? That's a desire for them. And many of them choose to start an online business, an entrepreneurial business. So by connecting not only the piece of me that is prominent, right, the freedom connector, but also connecting that to what my audience wants most, it helps with that messaging, right? Because messaging is just that middle piece between what you want to say and what resonates with your audience.
Well, how does that apply though? Then let's talk about someone who's different, right? So my personal brand story is one thing, but the connector that connects my story wouldn't necessarily be the same one of the service I'm providing or the ultimate goal that I'm serving for my clients, because I'm providing my clients something like peace of mind or, something along those lines. And that really isn't my story.
Okay. Well, yeah. And I mean, I guess we could talk more about your story if you want to do it. I would need to know a little bit more. When I work with my clients is like really going through those key pieces, because sometimes what we think, the surface level, I like to call it, there's something deeper there that can, in fact, then communicate to your audience. So while your peace of mind, right, that's what led you to becoming a lawyer, what led you to deciding to, become an entrepreneur and drop the suit and tie.
Well, so I think that is actually interesting, because now when you say it and I start thinking about it, I mean, one of the things maybe is part of why I do what I do now. It's peace of mind, but in a different sense, in that I kept seeing a frustration of seeing these clients who were having problems because they'd made mistakes early on, and it drove me nuts, and I couldn't figure out how to solve it as a traditional lawyer. And it was only through kind of taking this other approach that I was able to solve that problem. So I guess give myself a bit of peace so it's not nagging at me. So it's interesting that you say that.
Yeah, but I definitely see it like the connector, if you will, ties into your mission, right? So your mission is to provide a peace of mind, right? You mentioned that through your own journey, through your own story, you recognize that you really wanted to help people before they got to the point where it was too late, right? To give them peace of mind early on in their business. So I think that tapping into your story also sets you up for really a strong mission in your business as well.
Yeah, it's just this, I'll be honest with you, Michelle, it's just something that I have struggled with. And in coming up with my brand story, what really woke me up to this was reading Expert Secrets by Russell Brunson and going through that process. But again, it wasn't a perfect fit, because he's largely talking about where, you're teaching people who are kind of a couple of steps behind you. Mm-hmm. But I did come up with things, and it's great to understand this from your perspective. But actually, now that I mentioned that, I want to go to kind of another point that's related. All of these texts, and I think one of the things you talk about is weaving your personal story into kind of your ongoing brand story, meaning when you're talking to your audience, you will continue to talk about your personal story and things happening in your personal life. How do you make the decision of what to include and what not to include in those discussions?
Yeah, so that comes from knowing your audience. So by starting off with the inner work, by identifying the story, you start to really figure out like, who are the people that I want to serve? Who are the people that I really want to buy my products or buy my services or whatever it is for you? And the next step with that is really identifying these individuals, what they want, where they are. And that really helps you say, okay, these are the pieces of my story that I can share that not only make me an expert, but also build that trust with my audience. So one of my favorite quotes, I say it all the time, is if people like you, they'll listen, but if they trust you, they'll do business with you. And so I think the part of authentically showing up, sharing pieces of your story that resonate with your audience, that's what really builds the trust.
Well, and how do you have any suggestions for resources that people can go to help them build the skill of kind of weaving things that are happening in their lives into kind of their marketing messages? I mean, I know some of the greatest speakers I hear, it's natural. They just talk about things in their life and bring it down to the message that they're trying to convey. Is there a process or a resource that you think is helpful to help people build that skill?
Well, this is what I teach, right? So, and I taught it to myself. I couldn't find anything out there. I just kind of taught it throughout my own journey. So this is actually what I teach in one of my signature programs, is the whole process of what is the story? How do you identify the audience? How do you create the messaging that resonates with them? How do you use that to become visible? And how do you kind of tie all those pieces together to create a visual brand that has you standing out online?
Well, so why don't you go ahead and tell the listeners what that signature program is and how they can get it now. But then I'm going to have a follow-up question for you.
Yeah, definitely. So the program is called Your Brand New Adventure, and it is launching live for the very last time. The card is actually open right now, and it's really that process we talked about. It's a different approach to branding. It's something you don't typically find online. When we think about a branding program, we think about the fonts, the colors, the aesthetics, the photos, which is all fun and definitely a piece of it, but that's not where you should start. And so what I teach is, again, the story work, niching down, identifying the ideal client, creating the messaging, coming up with the content, because that's such a big piece of the visibility online, and then creating the colors, the fonts, and the photos. And a big piece of the program is really identifying the emotions you want your audience to feel. So I truly believe that people respond to emotion, to feeling. It's like 15 seconds on a website is the average, and imagine how fast we scroll through Facebook. So we really want to capture our audience, and we do that through emotional branding. And so that's really what I built this whole entire program around.
Well, so if people want to get more information about that program, where would they do that?
They can just go to brandmary.com/brandadventure.
Okay, that's great. Now, so from the way you described it, that's going to help people come up with kind of their overarching brand story and their brand. I guess I have a question about kind of on an ongoing basis, right? So let's say I have a brand that I have fully established, that I understand. Over the next year, a lot of things are going to happen to me. And I find that some of the best marketers, and in Expert Secrets and a lot of other places, they refer to this as the Seinfeld sequence, where you take seemingly insignificant things that happen to you in your life kind of as they're happening, and use those to then relate back to whatever message you want to get. Is that something that you discuss in that course, or is that not covered in it?
Oh my gosh, that's something I talk about all the time, but definitely in the course. Yeah. So I think something with the 3 key pieces, it's like that gets you started, right? Those 3 transitions, that gets you started and sets the foundation for your brand. But if you just share those 3 pieces, you're going to be so boring, right? If you're just sharing the same thing over and over. So I do truly believe in sharing those moments that have happened in your life. And again, that knowing your audience helps you make that connection. So I always like to I ask myself this, and I tell my community to do the same. Ask yourself, why should my audience care? If you can't answer that question about what you're sharing, then you're just sharing to share, right? It might not be the right time to share that. But if you're like, ooh, my audience will really take this, it will inspire them, my audience could really use this resource, then start sharing it, right? And again, that is what builds the trust and makes you more human.
Well, and so I assume you would apply that even if what you're sharing you think is useful, but I don't want to say it has nothing to do with the service you provide, but isn't related to the service, isn't in any way trying to market what you do, but you just think, hey, this is useful. I think my audience would enjoy this. You would still share that?
I would still share that. And I would encourage you, if you can find a way to tie it back. I always really think there's some way to tie it back. A great example I use is like, I shared a personal story the first time about trying to meditate with a newborn baby and how it was physically impossible, and how everyone was telling me I had to meditate to be an entrepreneur, and it just wasn't working. And I tied it back to, you don't have to do what everyone is expecting you to do, right? You can write your own ending. You can find what works best for you. So I kind of tied it back in on the end, but again, it was like, that wasn't the main point of the story. The story was to share the story and to inspire my audience.
Okay. I think that's a good piece of advice. Just put a little twist in there at the end to bring it back to what you do.
Definitely.
So I guess a question that I have for you, if someone, maybe they're not ready yet to take your course, or maybe they're in somewhere else in their journey, what is a piece of advice that you would give an entrepreneur to say, hey, you could do this in 5 minutes a day, or maybe it's something you could get done by the end of the week that would help them to build their brand or their brand story?
Yeah. So I am a big component of visibility. I think no matter where you are, even if you're like thinking about becoming an entrepreneur, to start like testing the waters with visibility. If you've been doing it for a year, you should be being visible online. I really think making that a top priority from the beginning, and starting with sharing those experiences, right? So sharing what we just talked about. If there's something that happened in your day that you feel like you can share, give valuable advice on, then do it. Whether that's through a live video, even if it's on your personal page, your Instagram, your business, if you have a private community, I think making the goal to become visible from the very beginning and constantly showing up as your authentic self is going to really help you create this bold and captivating brand.
I think that's great advice, and I think people should definitely take it. I'll be honest, one of my goals for this year is to be more visible, to be more consistent with my messaging. So, I think it's a piece of advice everyone could use. Michelle, you've given some really great advice, and you've already given us one place where if people want to look into that program, they can. But where else can listeners go to get in touch with you or get more information about your services?
Yeah, definitely. So I have a private community. It's called Authentic Brand Builders. You can just go to authenticbrandbuilders.com. Constantly in there, I do live Q&As, live videos. You can ask questions. I'm always giving in there. And then I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and Pinterest at Brand Mary Coaching.
Okay, we will have links to that, to all those things in the show notes for folks, so you don't have to try to scribble it all down.
Yeah.
But, Michelle, it has been my pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was fun.
That's all for now. Listeners, stay tuned for a quick legal lesson after the break, where I will give you a quick lesson about how you can protect the brand and the business that you're building with the advice from Michelle and my other guests.
And now for today's legal lesson.
Yeah! Michelle had some really great advice in today's episode, didn't she? I loved her talking about how you go about coming up with your brand story, and in thinking about whether you have a personal brand or not. And the legal lesson I want to talk about today is related to that first issue of choosing your brand. And it's an interesting issue that we talked about, that I hinted at with Michelle, how you can have a personal brand that still has a name that's not yourself. So again, in my case, Your Online Genius is a brand, but it's still personal. I'm still out there talking about it. And the same thing with Michelle. She has her own, name for her business and her website that's separate from her name. But one of the things I want to talk about is if you are, an entrepreneur who is launching a very personal brand, you might want to consider just using your name. And you might want to do that from a legal perspective. And the reason why is trademark law. Now, I've mentioned trademark law in a bunch of the legal lessons so far, and I'll continue to talk about it because it's an issue and probably one of the bigger issues that entrepreneurs face. Trademark law controls what you're able to use as a business name. You can't use a business name that someone else already has a trademark for. If there's going to be confusion by you picking a name, you can't use it. So, for example, I could not have named a legal business something that would be confusingly similar to LegalZoom, because LegalZoom is already out there. They're already doing something very similar. You might confuse it, so you can't do that. Now, there's an issue in the entrepreneurship space that I have seen that is very similar to an issue that I saw in an area that I have a particular personal affinity for, and that's the craft beer industry. For those of you who don't know, I brew beer on the side. I was pretty darn close to launching a brewery at one point, even after I was a lawyer, because it was so much fun. The reason I didn't is a long story, but when I did it, I had a very different approach to things than a lot of people did. Now, if you look at a lot of the craft beer out there, people are coming up with names for beers that they're trying to be clever. And they're trying to be clever by using some kind of pun on one or more of the ingredients in beer. So you'll see puns on hop a lot and puns on one of the 5 ingredients that is in beer. Well, you see the same or similar thing in the entrepreneurship space. It is the whatever you want to fill in preneur. And you see that all over the place, and you might come up with a name that you think, hey, that's great. I am the lawyerpreneur or something of that nature. And I have no idea. I haven't searched whether there is a lawyerpreneur, but I'm betting someone's already using it. I'm betting that there might actually be someone who's filed a trademark application for it because it's something that's kind of catchy. When there are only so many different puns or plays on words that you can use, you are likely to run into a problem where you may not be able to use the name. Or more importantly, it's not going to give you a brand differentiation anyway. So, for example, if someone comes up with a word that's a pun or a spin on entrepreneur, but it's something that's so commonly used that no one can trademark it, well, you're not going to be able to protect it anyway. So with that in mind, you need to think through these questions. So these issues will tend to counsel that you might want to choose a truly personal brand. And by truly personal brand here, I mean, just use your name. You could just use your name and you will almost never run into problems. So my law firm, for example, is just Klink LLC. I didn't try to come up with anything fancy or anything cute. Some people do, but I chose not to. And again, in the lawyer space or legal space, that's pretty common that you use names for the name of a law firm. So that's not strange. But in the entrepreneurship space, I would suggest you might want to consider the same thing. And again, if you think about it, most of the big name entrepreneurs, that's the approach they've taken. They use their name. And that's about all they use. Now, maybe they have some courses or they have some products that have specific names, but they simply use their name. And again, they're doing that for many reasons, but there are trademark advantages as well, because that way you're not going to run into a problem of not being allowed to use the name you choose. If, on the other hand, you want to use a name other than your individual name, you need to go through the process of doing your due diligence when it comes to trademark. And I've mentioned this before, but what you have to do is, number one, you need to make sure that no one has registered that name or any name similar already. So you do that by going to the United States Patent and Trademark Office. You can do that at uspto.gov. Got to click on the trademark tab, and then there's a thing called TESS, T-E-S-S, where you could do a search. So you need to do that first. Second, you need to search Google. Just see what comes up. Is anyone using the name already? Is it out there a lot, or is it a name that you're not seeing anyone use? And then the last piece is to search social media handles, domain names, etc. I like to use a service called Namevine because it searches for domain names and then a bunch of social media handles at the same time, but you can do it however you choose. But you need to clear it in all 3 of those ways before you start using the name. So if you think about it, as you're weaving and coming up with the connectors in your story and trying to say, okay, is there a connector, like Michelle talked about, that is a good word that I could use in my brand name, you need to do the search and make sure that you're not stepping on someone's toes. And again, you want to do that before you fall in love with the name, obviously, because the last thing you want is you fall in love with the name, start using it, then find out that someone else is already using it. So that's my quick advice for you. I'm going to leave it there. If you are going to use a name other than just your name, you need to do a trademark search. If you want to just use your name, you're not going to have a big problem because someone, can't prevent me, Bobby Klink, from, marketing myself as Bobby Klink. That's my name. I've been using it for a long time, and so you'll be in good shape there. So that's it for this week's lesson. Again, grab the mistakes cheat sheet at mistakes.youronlinegenius.com. That'll walk you through 4 of the most common mistakes I see. And also my other call to action, if you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe. Give us a rating and review. That helps with making sure that other people can find this information and can get the value that you are from the show. That's it. Next week, I've got another great episode planned that I'm looking forward to. But until next time, I'm Bobby Klink signing off.
Thanks for listening. And remember to visit mistakes.youronlinegenius.com to get your essential guide to the 4 legal mistakes that can doom your business and how to avoid them. Join us next week for another episode to expand your online genius and your success.